Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you joining us from around the world for the Carnegie Middle East Center's annual conference on what to expect for 2022. And if there's one thing we've learned in the last 2 years of this pandemic is that predictions are very hard to make, but a lack of foresight is even worse. So we should try very hard to plan for all eventualities. My name is Nivien Schepers, and I am a senior researcher on arms control and non-proliferation issues at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this panel, the last one for today, I believe, in which we'll be exploring the continuous threat from nuclear proliferation around the world, but particularly in the Middle East. As you'll have seen in this wonderful video introduction, a lot of the questions we'll be discussing today. So as 2021 comes to a close, this conversation couldn't come at a better time. The Biden administration has now been in office for nearly a year, providing us with an opportunity to take a quick look back at what it has achieved so far in terms of arms control and non-proliferation efforts, but even more importantly, to look forward toward next year and beyond as we approach a number of key deadlines and face a number of time-pressing challenges. So globally, the 10th NPT Review Conference is just around the corner, set to take place from the 4th until the 28th of January 2022 after several delays. So while there have been some successes to applaud, such as the extension of the New START Treaty, the world has witnessed a surge of geopolitical tensions, a hardening of rhetoric and nuclear defense postures, a breaking down of arms control agreements, and the continuation of several proliferation crises. So the review conference promises to be a very difficult one, and that's an understatement. We're also awaiting the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, currently in the works and to be made public in early 2022, which will lay out the administration's approach to U.S. nuclear weapons policy, which has ramifications domestically and internationally. And just one other key development I'll mention, which is happening closer to home, at least for me, since it takes place in Vienna, is related to the future of the Jcpoa and Iran's nuclear program, which again has an impact on the rest of the region and the non-proliferation regime at large. So talks to restore the agreement took place last week after several months without diplomatic exchanges, months during which Iran continued to advance its nuclear program much beyond the initial limits of the Jcpoa, and it seems that many of the compromises that were reached before Raisi's election have now been set aside. So talks are resuming tomorrow, hence the very timely discussion tonight, but the overall environment at the moment is not very optimistic. So to talk us through all these burning issues, what they mean for the broader region and the world, as well as what policy responses are available, we have three absolutely fantastic panelists who I'm delighted to now introduce. So our first speaker tonight is Rose Guttemoler, who serves as the Frank and Arthur Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. She's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and, of course, a non-resident senior fellow here in Carnegie's nuclear policy program. So throughout her career, Rose has served in a number of distinguished positions in government, academia, and think tanks, so you'll forgive me for not naming all of them. but she most recently served as the Deputy Secretary of NATO, and prior to that as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US State Department. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Rose, to share your views on the Biden administration's priorities for arms control and nonproliferation, as well as some expectations when it comes to the Middle East WMD free zone and how it will be addressed in the upcoming NPT review conference. Just before I give you the floor, though, I'll just introduce our two other panelists tonight. So our second speaker is Mark Hibbs, who is a non-resident senior fellow in Carnegie's nuclear policy program. He is an expert on nuclear energy, nuclear trade, and nonproliferation governance, and has covered these issues extensively both at Carnegie and prior to that as an editor and correspondent for nuclear energy publications. I don't think anyone in this field would contradict me if I say he knows the IAEA, nuclear safeguards, nuclear trade, and cooperation agreements like the back of his hand. So very much looking forward to your remarks. And thank you for joining us tonight, Mark, to share your views on specific nuclear risks in the Middle East and the US's responses to regional ambitions and nuclear hedging strategies. And then thirdly, our last but definitely not least speaker for tonight will be George Pirkovich, who is the Ken Olivier and Angela Nomilini Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he also oversees the Technology and International Affairs Program and the Nuclear Policy Program. So George has had a long and very distinguished career at Carnegie. He's authored a very, very large amount of publications on nuclear strategy, nonproliferation issues, and cyber policy, among others, and advised numerous government agencies on these same issues, and even worked, I've recently read, some time ago for a little-known US senator named Joe Biden, who happens to now be president. So thank you again for joining us tonight, George, as well, to provide us with some of your insights on the current state of the Jcpoa and what perspectives the US and its allies face in case of failure at a regional and international level. So for everyone following online, please do submit your questions through the comment section on the platform that you're using, so either YouTube or Facebook, as early as possible, so I can bring them into the conversation. So with all that said, please, Rose, the virtual floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you so very much, Naveen, and I'm delighted truly to be here. I wanted to, because it is very timely, talk at fair length about the NPT Treaty Review Conference. Indeed, this meeting is very timely since, as we have heard, the NPT Review Conference, Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, will convene on January 4th, and many important issues will be on the agenda, including the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone. I can tell you, and some of you may remember, but I was not pleased at the end of the 2015 review conference, and as the head of the US delegation, to have to block consensus at the last minute over the Middle East zone, ending that RevCon on a sour note. The unfortunate circumstances that led to that event were wrapped up in what I consider to be some tricky dealings by some of the parties, but that is definitely water under the bridge. The main point is there was a lot more in those last 24 hours of negotiation than meets the eye. I'm pleased to say that this year the interested parties seem determined not to let the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone issues ruin the 2022 review conference. Last-minute negotiations and attempts to jam the issues are being strenuously avoided. Egypt and the United States, for example, have been talking for months in advance to develop some joint understanding. As for the UN Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone Conference, it is off to a serious start. The first session convened in 2019 and the second in 2021. It just finished up a few days ago, last Friday on December 3rd. Although the United States did not attend the conference, I can say, looking in from the outside, that this latest session in particular seemed a success. Several key procedural documents were agreed, most importantly, the rules of procedure for the conference and a decision to convene annual intersessional meetings. This is where real work gets done. And so I do welcome these developments. However, for the conference to achieve its objectives, Israel will have to be in the room. I would therefore urge Arab states to begin processes of bilateral consultation with Israel about the Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone and the mutual interests that may be found in pursuing it. The process won't be easy, but it is necessary. I would like to say a word about the nuclear weapons states at the Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference and what they hope to accomplish there. The P5 were also meeting last week in Paris, UK, France, US, Russia, and China to plan for the review conference. It's a complex year in P5 interactions because China is swiftly modernizing its strategic nuclear forces, and we do not yet know what its goals are. It seems very likely that Beijing has decided to move away from strict reliance on second strike retaliation for its nuclear doctrine and toward more diversity in a larger force posture. Whether they are trying to sprint to parity with the United States and Russia is not yet clear. Whether they are intending to move away from second strike retaliation to more of a launch under attack or launch on warning nuclear doctrine is also not clear. But I do know that the United States intends to sit down and talk with China about these issues as soon as possible. Presidents Biden and Xi agreed in their phone call last month to embark on strategic stability talks, which will be the platform to do so and which I welcome very much. With these uncertainties, however, it's unclear how much the P5 are going to want to talk about the disarmament pillar of the Nonproliferation Treaty. They will likely prefer to talk about nonproliferation and peaceful uses. Nevertheless, I expect them to take some significant steps, such as a joint restatement of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. I also expect them to renew the project to develop a joint glossary of nuclear terms, an important stepping stone. And this I want to emphasize because people tend to discount this glossary project as not being very useful. But I see it as an important stepping stone to eventual nuclear negotiations, since agreed definitions is the most basic starting point for success in any such negotiations. So before I leave the floor, I just wanted to remark yesterday, there's a lot of developments now in the European security arena with the virtual summit yesterday between Presidents Biden and Putin, mutual promise between Moscow and Washington to take a look at European security architectures. There's a lot of talk, which I think is very interesting, about taking into account some of the lessons learned in regional conflicts in recent years. For example, in the Syrian civil war and the way in which the United States and Russia, together with Turkey and some other participants, were able to deconflict their military activities as a way to consider some new approaches to incident response and crisis management in Europe. So I do think that that is an important arena where developments in the Middle East and the experience of recent years may provide some new materials, some new ideas and precedents to consider to bolster the European security architecture, which has been quite battered in recent years by Russian neglect and by, frankly, not too much interest sometimes on the part of the NATO alliance as well. So I think this is an interesting new area and perhaps one where the direct experience of Middle East actors will be important to the European security future. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Rose, for your remarks and for touching upon many different topics, which I'm sure we'll get to develop a bit later. Please, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Naveen. Effective nonproliferation, no matter where it is more likely when the parties involved conclude that there is regime or rules of conduct that are sufficiently acceptable and consistent, at least at the working level. And in some parts of the world, there are fewer problems because most or all of the states, even states that have sensitive technology are parties to the NPT and accept and cooperate with multilateral verification. That's not so in the Middle East, where there are fundamental asymmetries that stand in the way of nuclear peace. If these things aren't addressed, including in the future, they will increasingly contribute to tensions and conflicts ever the more as states acquire and seek to acquire more nuclear technology. Some aspects of this dysfunctionalism, if you want to see it that way, in the regime in the Middle East, are derived, or are supported by an overarching absence of regional cooperation, trust, and transparency compared to some other parts of the world. At the top of the agenda for the longest period of time has been the status of Israel, a state which is outside the NPT with nuclear weapons and having hostile or adversarial relations with states in the regions, especially states that are acquiring nuclear capabilities. Increasingly, in addition to this, there is emerging a patchwork of multilateral verification obligations in the region among states, including states that have nuclear assets. The nuclear weapons status of Israel serves as a symbolic rationale for some of these states to resist verification. In addition to that, on the other side of the ledger, there's no indication that Israel would agree to give up nuclear weapons on the basis of an arrangement that would require multilateral verification. So that's the situation in the Middle East, which is quite unique. It's more difficult in many respects than other parts of the world. Concerning the lack of trust, we could ask the question whether all of the states in the region, given the legacy of lack of trust and transparency, if the states in the region really want to ban nuclear weapons. And I guess the answer might be maybe, but not unconditionally. If you look at what's going on with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, right now there's 52 state parties and 86 signatories, but none of them are in the Middle East proper. So that may be an indication of just how difficult and intransigent this bedeviling interrelationship is between the lack of trust and the lack of verification. Lack of trust and verification are both kind of a chicken and egg situation, and it's a complex matter. Back before 1990, when the world learned about a clandestine nuclear weapons program in Iraq, IAEA verification, which is centered on its safeguards program, safeguards were about materials, nuclear materials that were declared by states. Since Iraq, increasingly safeguards concerns, international verification by the IAEA is about undeclared materials and undeclared activities. What has happened, during the 90s and since is that the agency has now in its arsenal of tools or to address these issues. It has the additional protocol, which is an agreement between the agency and a member state that permits the IAEA to more effectively pursue any information about undeclared activities and materials in a country. In the Middle East, this is not an even playing field. There's no additional protocol in force in a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Oman, but but there is a protocol in some other countries. Basically, what the situation is in Iran is that Iran has a protocol which it has signed, and it is provisionally implementing this under the Jcpoa. But this agreement is not in force, and Iran could, in principle, legally reverse its decision to implement it. So, in the Middle East in general, this is an important matter. The additional protocol in the Middle East is important because the lack of trust that I mentioned about states' nuclear activities and tensions gives rise frequently to allegations that states are engaged in undeclared and clandestine nuclear activities. I did a quick thumbnail count. Since the 1990s, 9 countries in the region have been the target of such accusations. So for the region, it's critical. And there have been efforts made to make the additional protocol a condition of supply for nuclear transfers by supplier states to states, including in the Middle East. This is now the case for sensitive nuclear technology, enrichment and reprocessing technology, but it's not true for power reactors. So right now, currently in the Middle East, Russia is supplying power reactors to Egypt without an additional protocol. This is undermining efforts by others to persuade states in the region and elsewhere to conclude a protocol with the agency if they want to get access to modern technology. Whatever the outcome of the crisis with Iran, it's going to be up to each state in the region to conclude for itself at the end of the day whether it's worth taking the risk associated with programmatically challenging the global nonproliferation regime in the way that Iran has been doing that. And I would not want to preclude what will happen during this crisis management that we're living through right now. But it's probably the case, in my view, that states in the region would be more reluctant to challenge the agency and the regime if the Jcpoa parties and the United States and the IAEA Board of Governors respond to the current crisis without rewarding Iran for having breached the red lines of the Jcpoa since 2018. We're going to find out whether the leadership of the Jcpoa party states, as well as the Board of Governors, is up to that task. The organizers of this meeting today asked specific questions about the nonproliferation futures of the GCC and Turkey, and I will briefly address these in my comments. During the last couple of years especially, Saudi's leaders have said that they will respond to Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons in kind. I think it would be fair to take those words at face value. It has been said, including most recently by Kim Gattas, who is a Carnegie colleague and who will be addressing this meeting tomorrow, that Saudi Arabia felt betrayed by the United States when the United States secretly negotiated with Iran to conclude the nuclear deal. If that's true, and even if it isn't, it would be essential that the United States today includes Saudi Arabia in its ongoing diplomacy with Iran. This is clearly a relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia that requires attention. That being said, some of the alarm expressed recently about Saudi Arabia and its nuclear intentions and capabilities may be premature. So far, the Saudi Arabia nuclear program, which was announced with terrific fanfare a few years ago and plans to build a lot of reactors in the space of about 2 decades, this program is proceeding very slowly. The efforts right now are focused on a single power reactor project where construction might begin around 2025. They have not announced vendors. They've commission information and assistance from a consultant. But right now, the program is beset with a host of delaying issues. They include COVID, there's financing problems, and there's problems that the Saudis have been apparently having in establishing a university that's intended to be related to nuclear power development in the country. So it's not going very fast. A lot of attention recently, or a certain amount in the last year or two, has been devoted to a reactor that's being built in Saudi Arabia with support from Argentina. This, likewise, is not going very far, very fast. And it might even be 2024 or 2025 before this project is far enough that the IAEA would have to put any imported nuclear fuel under IAEA safeguards. So the safeguards issue is very, very critical in Saudi Arabia, but it's being addressed with a certain amount of attention, and it's done in a very judicious manner. My understanding is that this month, the IAEA is going to send a mission to Saudi Arabia to provide assistance to Saudi Arabia in anticipation of Saudi Arabia's safeguards, responsibilities, and needs when the time comes. The other Gulf states don't provide, as I pointed out before, a consistent verification picture. All the states, including Saudi Arabia in the region, will have to conclude safeguards provisions with the agency for any reactor or any equipment and material that they import. But so far, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Qatar don't have an additional protocol, and Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE do have one. The UAE, a decade ago, agreed in discussions with the United States to go even further than the protocol and to forego uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing. This was a unique commitment that the UAE made in discussions with the United States. It was not required by any multilateral arrangement. The Department of State at the time said that the United States would require the same commitment for nuclear cooperation elsewhere in the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia. So now we're in a situation where in the future, the United States government may have to weigh the value of a no reprocessing, no enrichment commitment by Saudi Arabia against the influence that U.S. industry might obtain if the Saudis elect to partner with U.S. industry for future power reactors if they don't want to agree to those kinds of commitments. So this is something to watch. We don't know how the U.S. is going to square the circle on this, but it's important that they pay attention. And then finally, there's Turkey. Turkey is a country which is frequently mentioned as a target of speculation about future nuclear proliferation. But in fact, Turkey has an additional protocol, and for several years, the IAEA has stated for the record that all of its information suggests that Turkey's entire nuclear program is declared to the IAEA. So Turkey's nuclear power program is right now looks like it's becoming based on a cooperation arrangement with Russia. Russia's diplomacy in Iran and in Syria would suggest that Moscow is more tolerant than the United States is of proliferation risk that would come from future threshold states, including Iran. But I would argue that if you look at the regional situation, the geopolitics would argue that the Russians would never accept Turkey taking steps toward the possession of nuclear weapons. A certain amount of concern has been raised about Erdogan, Mr. Erdogan, but in fact, while perhaps autocratic and unpredictable, his remarks about the lack of equity in international nuclear relations are not, in fact, an indication that Turkey will not uphold its NPT commitments. So finally, the last thing I will say here is that in general, anything the United States could do to increase the density of multilateral verification in the region, and show leadership at the IEA and elsewhere to defend the IEA safeguard system in the face of states' noncompliance. And lastly, to encourage countries to commit to restraint in developing sensitive nuclear technologies. All of these things would help reduce nuclear proliferation threats in the Middle East. These challenges are probably greater today than they were a decade ago, in part because of the rise of geopolitics involving both China and Russia. But the more states in the Middle East that aspire to deploy nuclear technology, the more critical a critical verification regime in the region will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very comprehensive overview, for highlighting some of the peculiarities of the region. As you say, the patchwork of verification obligations is very important to highlight in this case. I'm sure we'll get back to some of these specifics you mentioned, but before that, please, George, what can you tell us a bit more about where we're at and with the Jcpoa and Iran in particular, as it seems to be quite a fault line here?
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. And I'll try to be brief so we can have time for discussion. And I apologize in advance that I'm going to be fairly gloomy, I would say, especially in my remarks about the situation with Iran. I'd start first with the Iranian perspective of where we are now and the situation surrounding the negotiations that will resume this week in Vienna. Iran was upholding the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that had been agreed in 2015. And their view, correctly, is that President Trump and the U.S. broke the agreement, and therefore that the U.S. should make Iran whole. In other words, Iran doesn't owe the U.S. or anybody anything. The U.S. owes Iran to, in a sense, make up for the losses that Iran has experienced since Trump broke the Jcpoa and the U.S. imposed more sanctions and the world imposed more sanctions as a result of U.S. Secondary sanction. So since all of this was done in Iran's view against Iran at the wish of the U.S., Iran needs to be made whole before it could resume or rejoin the Jcpoa and reimpose the conditions that had been operative under the Jcpoa. Iran also wants guarantees that the U.S. won't do this again. That if Iran makes an agreement, resumes the Jcpoa, that the U.S. won't change its mind in 3 years or 2 years, as it did with Trump. A very reasonable demand that, of course, it's impossible for the Biden administration to meet. The position or perspective of the U.S. and Israel and others is different. That view tends to be there were shortcomings in the Jcpoa. There were concessions made to Iran that were reluctantly made and therefore were seen as shortcomings of the agreement. It didn't long enough. Some of the provisions weren't strict as people had wanted. But now, since Iran has broken some of the terms or its compliance with some of the terms after the U.S. withdrawal, Iran has gained additional knowledge and know-how, as well as additional nuclear material and technology, so that if there is going to be a return to a kind of agreement, the arrangement needs to be stronger to compensate for what Iran has gained in the last few years. Then I think there's a third group or perspective, which is that of opponents of the Jcpoa in the first place, which is a group in the United States, including in the Trump administration, and former Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, for example, had this view, which was no deal with Iran was acceptable, except an unimaginable one where Iran gave up all nuclear capability. Rather, the preference of this group was to push for regime change in Iran and to squeeze it hard enough, sanction it hard enough, maximum pressure long enough that somehow the regime in Iran would collapse. And this was a view of former National Security Advisor John Bolton, other Trump administration officials, and of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, funded by the late Sheldon Adelson and others close to Bibi Netanyahu. And that group had a general sense, again, especially throughout the Trump administration, that the only kind of nuclear deal that should be acceptable to the U.S. is one that gives the U.S. clear and obvious advantages over the other party. All right, I've had this explained to me by senior Trump administration officials, and this view is widely held in the Republican Party, that the idea of compromise and balanced agreements is unacceptable to them. They would rather be unconstrained on their side, but only an agreement that is worthwhile is only one where the other side makes the great majority of the concessions. We now have a new Iranian government whose negotiators very strikingly resemble John Bolton, for example, the former U.S. Undersecretary of State and National Security Advisor. These are people who are not used to negotiating, engaging in give and take, mutual accommodation or trade-off. They're doctrinaire, ideological, they have a clear view, the other side must concede to it. And so this is the challenge that the Biden administration faces. I think the Biden administration would like to find a diplomatic way to, perhaps in stages, get back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and then find a way to strengthen it. They will get attacked brutally in Washington by all Republicans and by some Democrats if they were to make an agreement that didn't get more than the Jcpoa did. But those critics also want to give Iran less than it got under the Jcpoa and don't recognize the perspective that the U.S. broke the Jcpoa and Iran had suffered consequences from that. And the idea of kind of making Iran whole as a result of the U.S. action is something that they won't consider. So if the Biden administration tried to do that, it would face great domestic resistance. Now, for background, I don't believe that the Iranian leadership has decided that they want to make nuclear weapons. And indeed, this is something that the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who was our former boss at the Carnegie Endowment until earlier this year, now director of the CIA, he stated this in an interview this week, that they do not believe that the Iranian leadership has decided to acquire nuclear weapons. But we're in a situation now that was like the situation in the 2000s, where there's a logic of that's driving Iran to ratchet up its nuclear capabilities and its nuclear activities. They're being pressed, they get more and more pressure, less interest demonstrated by the rest of the world in conceding to their point, so they have to do more to be threatening in order, in their view, to try to induce others to deal with them. And that goes on for quite some time. Their economy is hurting very much. People seem to want change. But it's very difficult for the Iranian leadership to succumb to a policy of pure pressure for all sorts of reasons. And they feel with justification that, in a sense, they didn't get the promised benefits from the Jcpoa, and now they've suffered more harm, and so they want some makeup for that. But there's no evidence that they would get that. So they, in a sense, are trapped in this logic of not wanting to have nuclear weapons, but kind of being pushed to try to seek more leverage that's threatening. Now, why might they have concluded they don't want nuclear weapons? Well, one is they're worried that they have been so penetrated by Israeli intelligence that it would be detected if they were trying to make nuclear weapons, and they would be attacked. And then you're talking about war, the outcome of which no one can predict. But also, for a long time, Iranian officials have understood that if Iran acquired nuclear weapons, in all likelihood, Saudi Arabia would at some point thereafter. And perhaps even that the rest of the world wouldn't try to stop Saudi Arabia because it would be seen as balancing Iran. And from Iran's point of view, that's the worst possible outcome. There's no way in the world in which Saudi Arabia is equal to Iran or can compete in any sense with Iran, except perhaps if you're talking about nuclear weapons. This is like India and Pakistan, where nuclear weapons are the great equalizer for Pakistan, much to the consternation of Indians. Well, Iranians kind of understand that that would be a risk they would face if they went forward and somehow successfully acquired nuclear weapons. This puts the U.S. in a situation where it can kind of wait, in a sense. Iran is suffering more from the current situation than the U.S. is, and obviously than the Europeans are, or the Russians or the Chinese. So you can say, well, we don't have to make concessions. Our economies are doing rather well. The Iranians are suffering. They need to make the concessions. The problem with that approach is that it's kind of true, but it's also leaves a very unstable situation where everybody's on edge, not knowing which direction things will go, where the risk of war, or at least military action that could lead to war, is acute. It's profoundly unsettling to Israel and Israelis, and so it's in many ways unacceptable. Although I am going to argue, as I conclude, it turns out that this kind of current situation of instability and anxiety is easier to tolerate for political reasons than the actions that would be taken to move to a diplomatic solution that would be acceptable to all the parties. Now, it's tempting to say, well, that can't be the case. I mean, this is such a bad situation. Surely the U.S. or somebody will do what it's necessary to try to resolve it. And I'd like to live in that world, but I don't. I live in Washington. And it's perfectly imaginable that this is a problem that's not going to be solved. And we have another example of it in North Korea, which has had nuclear weapons, where U.S. administration since 1992 have said that it was a priority and tried to do things about it, and basically have ended up with nothing, often for reasons of domestic political constraint. I think about the Palestinian situation over all these years, where the U.S., it ends up, there are things that are that you just let kind of fester and go on in an unstable way, because that's easier than the challenge of both the diplomacy but the domestic politics of trying to exert the kind of leadership that would be required to move it. And so if I had to predict what's going to happen, is, given the political situation here, and that the U.S. is going to have another election in November of 2022, and the question of whether Republicans will take over the Senate and retake over the House of Representatives is a very pressing question. I think that makes it more difficult for the Biden administration to push for the kinds of accommodations that would be required to make a deal work for Iran. So I would predict there's not going to be a deal, and that Republicans will still do well in that election. And then you can forget about a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis, and we'll just have to figure out how to deal with the instabilities that may result from that. So I'll end with that, having warned you that I would be gloomy. I delivered on my promise, and we'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George. You definitely delivered on the promise of being gloomy. And thank you actually for pointing out some of the domestic realities of where the Jcpoa sits in the US, because I think being in Europe, we sometimes forget how it's tied to other elements. So let me have a quick look at the questions coming in. I think a lot of them are related to some of the sort of projecting further what would happen. So I think, George, I've delivered a little bit on what it means on the US side. I think, Mark, you've also mentioned a little bit what it means in the Middle East and also for the IAEA. I was wondering if I could perhaps then push you a little bit further on sort of the immediate deadlines coming up, what that means for the IAEA in particular, for its credibility and for safeguards in general, and then perhaps directing this to you, Rose, how that impacts the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And you also spoke about the Middle East WMD free zone, but more generally the state of the non-proliferation regime if we arrive at this NPT REFCON with a situation that's worsening in Iran in particular, as that does seem to be at the crux of a lot of the proliferation risks in the Middle East. Mark, would you perhaps like to start, and then Rose?
Thank you, Naveen. The crisis with Iran in the nuclear side has two components. One has to do with the Jcpoa, and the other one is with Iran's safeguards obligations through the NPT. In both cases, the agency, the IAEA, is involved as a verification agency. But the real pivotal power in this is in the Board of Governors and at the Jcpoa. The Secretariat of the IAEA has been doing what it's supposed to be doing, and it has been reporting to the Board of Governors, and it reports to the Jcpoa about the results of its interactions with the Iranians. So, in a sense, the centerpiece of it is what happens at the IAEA, but the political decision making is devolved to both the Jcpoa's parties and to the board members. And what we've seen happen at these board meetings that come up every 3 months is that there is a presentation by the Director General of the IAEA where he tells member states what they're finding in the field and of the vicissitudes and troubles they're having in dealing with Iran and getting Iran to answer questions from the agency. And if there's been any kind of drama that's played out between the IAEA, Iran, and the board members over the last, say, 6 to 9 months, it's really been about an issue which is, in a way, kind of I would argue, it might be a side issue, but may be important. Namely, whether the IAEA, in the word of its board members, will pass a resolution raising the issue of the IAEA of the Iran's compliance with the agency to the UN Security Council. This is something which has come up again and again, and what we see happen is that the IAEA's member states have been increasingly reluctant to do this. This has been debated again and again. It will come up again, and the implication is that in the decision so far by the board members not to cite Iran to the Security Council is perhaps a concern that if they were to do that, they would, in fact, prompt or provoke Iran to quit the NPT. And that could happen again. But in fact, if they were to do that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Security Council would have to take any actions. It could, I would argue that if they were to do this, that might, it's kind of an unclear situation. On the one level, if they were to do that, they might prompt Iran to escalate. But on the other hand, they might prompt Iran to pull back a little bit, realizing that there is unity among the board members and the membership of the agency that Iran has to cooperate with one problem. And that problem is the rise of the geopolitical factor in the boardroom, where the Russians and the Chinese can no longer be counted upon by the United States and other parties in the Jcpoa or in the boardroom to share their views about nonproliferation compliance. So what we've seen in the past is an effort by Russia and to some extent by China to provide some diplomatic cover for Iran since Trump abrogated the deal in 2018. And we don't know how that's going to go forward. So essentially, what I'm telling you is in a nutshell that the agencies, the IEA's diplomacy is basically stymied. It's not going to be up to the IAEA Director General or the board to solve this problem. It's really in the hands of the United States and other countries in the Jcpoa to do this.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, of course, you highlight a very important point that ultimately it does go back to some of the bigger geopolitical tensions that we're facing. Rose, please, would you like to perhaps address this as well? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Mark, thank you so much for your wise comments. It's so interesting to hear your remarks about the different dynamics in the boardroom of the IAEA these days. And I think that's an important point that I would like to touch on also in talking about the mood and the overall interactions at the NPT Review Conference. In 2015, interestingly enough, we had a Jcpoa process going forward well at that point. And to be honest with you, Iran was disposed to be rather helpful on the Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone efforts that we had underway, the difficult negotiations, including the difficult 11th hour negotiations that we tried to undertake to get to some agreement. And that dynamic to me was an important sign that Iran at that time was being carried along by a certain, or perhaps I should say in a more activist way, were taking part in the whole process leading to the Jcpoa with a rather more positive notion in mind of playing this responsible role in the NPT community and working well with the IAEA, et cetera, et cetera. I'm concerned nowadays, not so much. Again, the UN meeting session of the UN conference on the Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, the session that took place last week showed Iran bashing the United States along with Syria. They were those really who have raised their voice in criticism of the United States along with Russia, and overall a rather less, I would say, positive attitude toward trying to be helpful in this particular arena. I don't, in the end of the day, as I intimated in my remarks to open up our discussion, that this will, at the end of the day, have the impact that we saw in 2015 of the Middle East zone issue breaking up the conference and resulting in no consensus at the end. I do think that there will be and there is a solid and serious effort afoot to ensure that that doesn't happen. So it will happen, but it's not going to happen, in my view, with the help of Iran. Iran will be a critic, will be difficult overall, and I would perhaps expect to see this in a larger set of issues. I noted the P5 countries, for example, would probably like to avoid talking too much about the disarmament pillar of the NPT. Iran won't be the only country pushing to get that attention squarely back on the disarmament pillar. There will be a number of countries, and here I note the implications of the entry into force of the so-called ban treaty, the TPNW, and what influence that will have overall on the mood and the environment at the NPT Review Conference. But the dynamics are different than in 2015. I do not see them necessarily leading to disaster, but they are very different, and Iran, I think, will be playing a very different role there.
Thank you very much, Rose. I might take a quick step back based on a question that was addressed in the chat to address China's role at the moment. I think it's been very much discussed in these last couple of years about how to bring China to the negotiating table. So it's no surprise that this is a constant concern in particular now. I know, Rose, you mentioned this at the moment, that there are some uncertainties about what China is actually doing, how that's interpreted, how the US should take that into account, and how that has an effect on various forums where whether it be the NPT review conference or the P5 or at the bilateral level. So I was wondering if you could perhaps address that question, and I would give also the floor to George and Mark to discuss that, because obviously anything that happens also has an impact on the non-proliferation regime.
As I mentioned in my remarks at the beginning, I do see that the United States and China are on the cusp of beginning some talks on these issues. I was not a fan of the approach that the Trump administration took, which was trying to shoehorn China into the bilateral nuclear reduction negotiations between the United States and Russia to replace the New START treaty. That didn't make sense because the US and Russian arsenals are so much larger than the Chinese. Even 10 years out, they will continue to be larger than the Chinese, at least their arsenal of nuclear warheads. So I do think that it's important to keep a sharp eye on what China is up to and to follow their modernization very closely and to ask them very directly about what their objectives are. And for that reason, I've been pleased to see that the United States and China are planning to embark on these strategic stability talks, evidently based on the Biden-Xi phone call of a couple of weeks ago. I will just also recollect a number of precedents. The precedents relate to the P5 discussions over the past 10 years and the fact that China in that setting has been rather a proponent of strategic stability talks among the P5, and I would hope to see that develop going forward. The second set of precedents I will point to is the very solid set of bilateral strategig stability talks that the Obama administration carried forward with the Chinese. I myself chaired the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Department of State at the undersecretary level discussions that took place. And then there was a very interesting military to military strategic stability dialogue. And the Chinese sent every other year, they'd send to Washington some extremely smart military officers to ask some very probing questions. I think they didn't give us much of a sense of what they were up to, but nevertheless, by the tenor of their questions, it was possible to determine what their interests and concerns were, as well as their priorities. They would always come over to the Department of State and engage in a very substantive discussion. So I think there are some healthy precedents out there that perhaps can be built on. We will see what the Biden administration decides as to how it wants to proceed. But I do think we need to bear in mind that we have some experience talking with the Chinese about these issues, and we shouldn't feel like we're starting from scratch.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that note of optimism. George, would you perhaps like to address that as well?
Yeah. I just would build on what Rose said. What she said, I thought was just spot on. And clearly going forward, it will be vital to engage China in dialogue, diplomacy on basically on stability, but also how we can try to restrain arms races and possible escalation. One of the challenges in all of that is, it became a cliche for the U.S., including in the last administration, China must be brought into the process. But no one ever said, well, what are we going to talk about? Because when you talk with Chinese counterparts, they have a number of things. They said, do you accept a relationship of mutual vulnerability with China? In other words, a deterrence relationship. Or is a U.S. objective to be able to negate China's nuclear deterrent by a combination of nuclear strikes, conventional strikes, and missile defense? In which case, which is what it looks like to the Chinese, in which case, what are we going to talk about? Because you haven't accepted that stability requires us to maintain a survivable nuclear deterrent. And the U.S. would say, well, we can't actually make that commitment about mutual vulnerability that we have with Russia. Chinese go, that's interesting. Well, the allies will get upset if we do that. And the Chinese say, well, okay, but how does that look here? Can we talk about limiting missile defenses then, possibly? Because again, the concern was you have an offensive capability that could hit China's relatively small nuclear forces and then use missile defense to block whatever China had left that it could retaliate. And so are you willing to talk about limits on missile defenses, which could reassure we, the Chinese, that we could maintain our deterrent, and that could be a basis of stability. You said, no, we can't talk about limiting missile defenses. Don't worry, it's not aimed at you. So what is it that we're going to talk about is one of the questions. And I think, Rose alluded to it. I'm imagining that in the discussions she had with Chinese counterparts from the PLA, some of the questions that they asked pertain to some of these issues. And so if the US could get into a position where it could answer those questions in a way that's constructive, I think then let's put the burden on China to then have to resist ideas to draw them into restraint, transparency, and limitations. But the US hasn't been forthcoming enough on issues of concern to China in the stability domain to kind of force them to come out and address the issues of concern. So I hope that could change.
But so what you're saying is there's still a lot of discussion that needs to be done before we can get to any form of agreement. Mm-hmm. As we're slowly starting, I think, to wrap up, Mark, unless you wanted to urgently jump in, I might try and finish on a positive note by asking all of you perhaps one positive development that we could perhaps expect next year, whether it's related to the review conference, the nuclear posture review, or more generally, just to end on a light note, given the very serious topic at hand, unfortunately, something to be positive about. Mark, would you like to start?
Well, perhaps. In coming off the remarks that Rose and George had to offer, the issues about China's engagement at the agency is something which does offer us the prospect that some more positive attention will be coming through. In the beginning, when China began intervening more often in Vienna, there was a great deal of concern that China would enter the conversation by saying, well, when the rules on nonproliferation were set by the West and by the United States, China, we were not in the room. So these aren't our rules. What we've seen indicates that the Chinese have pivoted away from that position if they were ever really going to be seriously adopting it. And we've now got to the point where we're anticipating a more intensive discussion between the United States and China on nonproliferation, but also between China and the agency's directorate, where it is serious. The Chinese are engaging. There is a talking point that China offers, which is somewhat similar to the talking point that the Russians bring forth in the open space. But what we hear is that behind the scenes, as in the case of Russia, there is a dialogue that goes on between the United States and Russia, and now one that could be emerging in 2022 between the United States and China on nonproliferation affairs, which is positive. And one area they can build on, and they very well may, is that throughout the problems that have occurred in the relationship between U.S. and China generally, there is an operating non-proliferation relationship that exists between China, the IAEA, and the United States, namely over Taiwan. This was set up when China became a member of the United Nations, and China and the United States agreed on the modalities for managing nonproliferation in Taiwan, a country that had nuclear assets, a country that looked as if it might obtain nuclear weapons-related capabilities. And the Chinese and the United States managed that very successfully over a period of 30 years. So that's one area that they can refer to in moving forward in nonproliferation in 2022 and beyond.
Thank you very much, Mark. George, what about yourself?
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you wanted to end on a positive note, Naveen, because it reminds me, I have known and worked with Rose for more than 30 years, and I respect her. And one of the things I always say about Rose, not in her presence, but to everybody, she's the most positive person I've ever known. And working in this area, it's difficult to be positive. So I cede my time to Rose for the positive reflections that you have asked for. Rose.
Excellent. Then Rose, the final word, the final positive word is yours.
That's because you always have to be Eeyore, George. You just have to be Eeyore. Thank you, Mark. Those were really interesting remarks again about the special interactions and relationships among IAEA China, the United States, and with regard to Taiwan, very interesting and something to keep a sharp eye on, as well as Chinese nuclear developments. I will just be positive again by taking us back to Europe and seeing the emphasis on reviving the European security architectures. The United States and NATO are never going to give Russia legally binding guarantees that NATO won't enlarge. That contradicts the Washington Treaty, NATO's foundational document, which says that countries should have the right to decide for themselves whether they will have a security relationship with NATO or with anybody else, or be completely neutral. But again, I want to make reference to the difficult, indeed, crises and conflicts that have been underway in the Middle East in recent years. But nevertheless, in the cusp of those conflicts, there have been important steps taken to ensure deconfliction, ensure crisis communication. And I think, once again, that some lessons that have been learned in the Middle East can help now to revivify the European security architecture. So I give that as a tasking to us all. And I hope in the end of the day, despite some of the dire crises we've had to face in the Middle East and continue to face with the refugee problems and related issues, that nevertheless we can also take some positive lessons learned and apply them.
Thank you very much, Rose. Since we're already, I think, a few minutes over time, I'm just going to leave it here. But thank you to all three of you for your very wise remarks. And thank you to everyone who followed online. Have a lovely evening or day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.